The county fairgrounds were alive with noise that afternoon, though not the pleasant kind of laughter and cheer. It was the low rumble of voices, men joking, women whispering, children tugging at sleeves in impatience, the restless background of a horse auction. Dust hung in the air, stirred by hooves and boots clinging to everything in sight. The smell of sweat, hay, and old wood pressed down like an invisible weight. Inside the auction barn, the crowd shifted as the next horse was brought into the ring. The animal was no sight to admire. Thin, ribs poking out beneath a coat that had long ago lost its shine, its gait uneven, favoring a rear leg that dragged with each step. The lead rope jerked as the wrangler urged him forward, but the horse only shuffled, head low, eyes dulled by exhaustion. The audience responded the way people often do when confronted with weakness, with ridicule. A few scoffs rippled through the rows of benches. Someone muttered a sharp laugh. Another man shook his head, smirking as if to say, "Why bother?" Even the auctioneer hesitated, staring at the creature like he wasn't sure it was worth lifting his microphone. Finally, he cleared his throat. Lot number 61. Gelding. 6 years old. No papers. Starting bid at $1. A murmur of disbelief swept across the room. $1. For a horse? The words themselves carried more mockery than promise. A few people chuckled outright. One woman turned to her neighbor with a knowing look that said, "Not even worth that." No hands went up. At the back of the ring, where the board sagged and the light fell in dusty beams, stood a man few paid attention to. His hat was bleached from years under the sun, his coat missing a button, and his boots bore the dried weight of mud that never seemed to wash away. He was older, though not frail, with the kind of presence that carried quietness rather than force. His name was Elijah Creel. Most in the county knew little about him anymore. Once he'd owned a thriving ranch. Once his son had ridden at his side. But the ranch had been lost, the son had vanished, and in the years that followed, Elijah had chosen silence over company. People whispered about him, filling the gaps with rumor. A man hardened by loss, a man who spoke less each year, a man living among memories instead of neighbors. Elijah's eyes, however, were sharp. He studied the gelding not as the crowd did, not with judgment, but with a patient curiosity. The horse shifted on its bad leg, tugging faintly at the rope. Its coat was patchy, its ribs pronounced, but in those tired eyes Elijah caught something. Not fire, not rebellion, but a stubborn thread of endurance. Tired, beaten, but not broken. He lifted his hand. $1, he said. The auctioneer blinked, uncertain he'd heard correctly. Then he adjusted the microphone. "We've got $1. Do I hear two?" Silence. Going once, going twice. The gavel came down with a sharp crack. "Sold. To the gentleman in the back." The sound echoed like a verdict, but the crowd responded with snickers. A man near the front muttered loud enough for others to hear, "Should have paid him to take it." Another called after Elijah, "That horse is more glue than gallop, old man." Elijah didn't reply. He only nodded when the wrangler handed him the rope. The horse did not fight, did not resist. It stood, as though resigned to every bad hand life had dealt it. Slowly, step by step, Elijah walked it out of the ring toward his old trailer parked at the far edge of the lot. The horse's limp became more pronounced on the gravel, each step clicking softly, like a clock counting down. Elijah did not hurry. Instead, he matched his own stride to the creature's broken rhythm. When they reached the trailer, Elijah set his hand against the horse's neck. "Name's Samson," he murmured, voice low and even. "Don't know yours yet, but we'll get there." The horse flicked an ear but gave no protest. Elijah opened the trailer gate. After a moment's hesitation, the gelding stepped inside. The drive home took an hour, through rolling fields the color of autumn, gold and brown, dotted with collapsed fences and barns weathered nearly to ruin. Elijah's property sat near the end of a gravel road. Once it had stretched wide and prosperous. Now it was reduced to a few acres that could still be managed. Most of the barns were boarded, and only one stable remained standing, leaning to one side like an old man favoring a weak hip. Elijah parked beside it. He lowered the ramp and whistled softly. The gelding backed out, head low, hooves crunching softly in the dirt. Elijah led him to a stall, spread fresh straw, and set a bucket of water before him. "No rush," he whispered. "You've got time now." That evening, Elijah sat on his porch, a chipped mug of weak coffee warming his hands as the stars blinked awake over the wide plains. From the stable came the faint shifting of hooves, the occasional heavy breath of a horse too weary even for dreams. Elijah hadn't come to the auction intending to buy anything. In truth, he sometimes attended just to look, to see what was being discarded, as though watching the forgotten offered him some odd kind of solace. But when he'd seen the horse, broken, limping, ridiculed, something stirred inside him. It reminded him of Cypress, the last horse he'd truly called his own. Cypress had been a wild Mustang, full of fire and fury, a creature Elijah had spent years gentling and training until they moved as one. They had been companions in the truest sense, riding across plains in silence, speaking not with words, but with trust. But Cypress had died 5 years earlier, and not long after Elijah's son had disappeared without a trace. The stables had stood empty since, haunted only by memory. He hadn't been looking to replace Cypress. He knew better than to think that possible. But something inside told him the gelding deserved more than laughter and pity. Morning came with a sharp wind and the cries of distant hawks. Elijah rose before the sun, carried a bucket of oats to the stall, and pushed open the door. The horse lifted his head slowly, watching with weary eyes. "Going to call you Dusty," Elijah said, "because that's what you were when I found you." Dusty sniffed at the oats, then took a cautious bite. In the days that followed, Elijah did not push. He didn't saddle Dusty or demand anything from him. He cleaned the stall, carried fresh hay, and let the horse watch him as he worked around the yard. Each day, Dusty's head lifted a little higher. The limp eased with rest. And when Elijah approached with a brush, Dusty did not shy away. He simply stood, his eyes following each slow, careful stroke. Elijah filled the silence with words. He spoke of the weather, the rust on his truck, the price of feed. And one evening, brushing Dusty's mane, he spoke of his son. "Luke," he said softly, "loved horses more than people. Took off one night after we fought. Never came back. Not a letter. Not a word." Dusty flicked an ear, listening. "Every time I came to one of those auctions, part of me thought I'd see him, with some horse he saved, proud as ever." Elijah sighed. "But it's always just ghosts." The wind stirred the grass outside. Elijah's hand rested gently against Dusty's neck. "You're the first I've brought home since then." That night, for the first time in years, he left the stable door cracked open, letting the sound of breathing travel between walls. The days slid into a steady rhythm, each morning beginning with the creak of Elijah's boots on the porch steps and the sound of Dusty shifting in his stall. The horse was cautious at first, watching Elijah with the wary eyes of one who had been handled roughly before. But patience worked its quiet magic. Every measured step Elijah took, every bucket of water placed without hurry, every brushstroke that lingered long enough to soothe but never press, slowly carved away at the wall of mistrust. Elijah never forced his presence on the gelding. Instead, he treated Dusty like a skittish neighbor who might, in time, come knocking if given the space. When Dusty's ears flicked forward instead of back, Elijah noticed. When the limp eased after a week of careful rest and better feed, Elijah allowed himself the faintest smile. It was progress, small but steady. The old rancher had lost the habit of talking much to people, but he found himself speaking to Dusty in low tones as he worked. He spoke of ordinary things, the fence that needed patching, the weather that wouldn't hold, the ache in his knees when he bent too long. Slowly, those ramblings grew into confessions no one else had ever heard. "My boy, Luke," Elijah murmured one evening while brushing tangles from Dusty's mane. He was a firebrand. Loved horses the way other kids love trouble. Spent hours in the saddle, like he belonged there more than anywhere else. We fought the night he left. He wanted more than this place could give him. I told him he was throwing away what mattered. He walked out, and I never saw him again. Dusty flicked an ear, snorted softly, and shifted his weight. Elijah's hand lingered on the horse's neck, his throat tight. Not a letter, not a call. Just silence. Been 12 years now. Sometimes I think the silence weighs more than the loss. For the first time in years, Elijah felt the relief of saying the words aloud. Dusty, of course, offered no judgment. But the way the horse leaned faintly into the brush felt like understanding. Over the following weeks, Elijah began to test boundaries. Not with force, but with patience. He led Dusty into the round pen one late afternoon, the sun bleeding low across the horizon. There was no saddle, no bridle, only a rope halter and time. Dusty circled warily, his ears flicking back and forth, but he did not bolt. Elijah moved with deliberate calm, guiding his steps not with dominance, but with presence. When Dusty finally turned in, lowering his head, Elijah felt a pulse of something long dormant. Trust. "That's it," he whispered. "That's the start." The days of cautious brushing gave way to short walks. Walks led to light lunging, then to the introduction of a saddle. Dusty stiffened beneath the unfamiliar weight, but Elijah never rushed. He tightened the cinch slowly, speaking all the while in that steady, low tone. When the bit touched Dusty's mouth, there was resistance, but not rebellion. It was as if the horse had been waiting all along for someone who would not punish hesitation. By the second week, Elijah swung his old body into the saddle. His knees protested, and his back groaned beneath the shift, but Dusty stood still, every muscle taut with uncertainty. Elijah breathed deep, allowing the tension to ease from his own frame. "We're all right," he said quietly. "Just you and me." The first steps were awkward, more negotiation than motion, but Dusty obeyed. They walked in slow circles, each stride an agreement between two souls learning to trust again. By the end of the ride, Elijah slid down, rubbed the horse's face, and felt the animal lean, just slightly, into his touch. Evenings began to carry a new rhythm. Elijah no longer sat on the porch staring at an empty yard. Now he watched Dusty graze, muscles filling out, coat beginning to shine. There was silence still, but no longer felt hollow. The horse's presence filled something Elijah hadn't realized was aching so deeply. It was on one of those evenings that a sound interrupted the fragile peace. Gravel crunched beneath unfamiliar tires. Elijah turned, squinting into the dusk as a truck rolled down his drive. Newer, cleaner, sharper than anything that belonged on his property. The engine cut, the door opened, and a man stepped out. Tall, lean, early 40s. His jeans were dark, his shirt crisp, his boots polished. The hair was shorter, the face harder, but the eyes froze Elijah where he stood. "Luke." His son paused mid-step, nerves flickering across his face. "Hey, Dad." Elijah's breath caught. 12 years of silence, of unanswered birthdays, of empty holidays, collapsed into a single, heavy moment. His mouth worked, but no sound came. Luke scratched the back of his neck, eyes flicking toward the stable. "Heard from someone you'd been to the auction. Said you walked out with a half-dead horse. Figured I had to see it for myself." Elijah swallowed, his voice rough. "Didn't think you'd ever come back." "I didn't either," Luke admitted. The weight between them was palpable, years pressing down like invisible walls. Finally, Elijah gestured toward the porch. "You hungry?" Luke nodded. Inside, they ate reheated stew and old bread. The conversation came haltingly at first. Luke spoke of the ranches he had drifted through, of colts broken and barns mended, of nights spent under open skies and mornings in stranger towns. He didn't apologize, not directly, but the tone of his voice carried something softer, something almost like regret. Elijah listened, nodding at intervals, the silence between them no longer unbearable but tentative, like testing an old wound. When Luke asked about Cypress, Elijah looked away. "Died the year after you left. Wandered into the north pasture one night, and never came back." Luke's face tightened. "I figured. He was always half wild." After dinner, Elijah brought him out to the stable. Dusty lifted his head, ears twitching. "He looked worse when I got him," Elijah said quietly. "Had nothing left in him but air and hope." Luke stepped forward, studying the gelding with practiced eyes. He extended a hand, let Dusty sniff, then brushed his fingers gently down the horse's neck. "He's got more fight than I expected," Luke said softly. "That limp won't stop him forever. His eyes are sharp." "I wasn't looking for another," Elijah murmured. "Didn't think I could care again." Luke didn't reply right away. His hand lingered against Dusty's coat, his gaze thoughtful. Finally, he said, "You cared anyway." The silence that followed wasn't empty. For the first time in years, Elijah felt the fragile thread of possibility, not just for Dusty, but for himself, and maybe even for his son. The night closed in around them, cool and still. Dusty shifted in his stall, head lowering to rest. Elijah and Luke stood side by side in the quiet, the weight of years still present, but no longer unbearable. Something had shifted. Not forgiveness, not yet, but the faint stirrings of it. And for Elijah it was enough. Enough to keep breathing, enough to keep hoping. The road ahead remained uncertain, but the path had begun. Morning came sharp and clear, the kind of air that promised both labor and possibility. Elijah woke earlier than usual, driven by the restless knowledge that his son was under the same roof for the first time in over a decade. The old house creaked as if remembering the weight of family again. He poured himself a cup of bitter coffee, stepped outside, and found Luke already at the stable. His son leaned on the stall door, watching Dusty chew hay with steady patience. "You're up early," Elijah said, voice rough from sleep. "Old habits," Luke replied. "Besides, he's worth watching." Elijah followed his gaze. Dusty's coat had begun to glow with the sheen of health, muscles slowly returning under the discipline of rest and food. Yet his eyes remained cautious, uncertain if the world around him could truly be trusted. Elijah knew the feeling well. It mirrored his own hesitance toward his son. They began to work together in small ways. Luke repaired a sagging gate that Elijah had long ignored. Elijah mended tack while Luke swept the barn aisle clean. Neither spoke much at first, but silence no longer pressed as heavily as before. And when Luke finally asked if he could ride Dusty, Elijah's instinct was to hesitate. That horse was not just a rescue now, he was a lifeline. But something in Luke's tone, gentle, measured, seeking permission rather than taking it, convinced him to agree. The first ride was cautious. Luke saddled Dusty with the care of a man who understood that every buckle and strap carried weight beyond leather. He mounted smoothly, sitting tall but not imposing. Dusty shifted uneasily, ears flicking back. Luke's hands were steady, his voice calm. "Easy, boy. Just listening today." They circled the pen, walking slow, each step deliberate. Elijah leaned against the rail, his heart tight. He expected a misstep, a refusal, some sign that the horse was not ready. Instead, he saw a delicate conversation unfolding, Luke guiding with subtle pressure, Dusty responding with guarded trust. The limp showed faintly, but it no longer defined the horse. By the time Luke dismounted, Dusty stood square, calmer than before. "You've done right by him," Luke said, handing the reins to his father. "He trusts you. That's harder than training." Elijah only nodded, though his chest swelled with a quiet pride he hadn't felt in years. Days blended into weeks, and a rhythm took hold. Father and son worked side by side, Dusty at the center of their labor. Luke's presence stirred memories Elijah had long buried, his boy riding Cypress bareback across the pasture, laughter carrying on the wind. But there were shadows, too. Each time Luke paused, gazed distant, Elijah sensed the weight of years apart pressing in again. One evening, as the sun bled orange across the hills, Luke leaned against the fence, arms folded. He could show well, not just ride. He's got the look now. Strong, balanced. He'd turn heads. Elijah frowned. "I'm not one for crowds." "It's not about crowds," Luke said. "It's about proving what you've built here. Proving him. Proving yourself." The words stirred something Elijah didn't want to admit. Dusty had come far, from a creature mocked and discarded to a horse with life in his stride. But to parade him before strangers? To risk judgment again? The thought made Elijah's chest tighten. That night, he found a flyer left on the porch bench. Local spring horse show. 3 weeks away. Scrawled across the back in Luke's handwriting were the words, "I'll ride him if you let me, or stand beside you if you change your mind." Elijah sat with the paper long into the night, listening to Dusty shifting in his stall. The idea frightened him, not because of failure, but because of how much he suddenly wanted success. Training shifted after that. Each session held more purpose. Luke worked Dusty through obstacles in the round pen, gates to open, poles to cross, a small bridge that creaked under weight. At first, Dusty hesitated, nostrils flaring, but Luke never rushed him. Patience was their unspoken creed. Step by step, the horse learned. By the second week, he crossed the bridge without faltering, ears forward, stride steady. Elijah watched each session with conflicted pride. The gelding was no longer just a rescued animal. He was a symbol of second chances. Yet the more Dusty grew into strength, the more Elijah feared losing him, either to competition, to failure, or to the sun who might still vanish again. One afternoon, Elijah caught Luke standing alone in the pasture, staring toward the horizon. His shoulders were tense, his jaw set. The sight struck Elijah with sudden dread. He approached slowly, boots crunching the dry earth. "Thinking of leaving again?" he asked. Luke didn't answer immediately. "I've had offers," he admitted finally. "Work out west. Decent pay. Different sky every night." Elijah swallowed, forcing his voice steady. "I'm not asking you to stay. But the south pasture needs a strong hand. Fence line's gone weak. There's work here if you want it." Luke turned, eyes narrowing slightly. "You offering me a job?" "I'm offering you a place," Elijah said. The words hung heavy in the air, honest and raw. Luke studied him for a long moment, then nodded faintly, as though filing the offer away, where it might matter later. The show approached quickly. The night before, Elijah could hardly sleep. He paced the porch, coffee cooling in his hands, while Luke brushed Dusty with careful strokes. The horse stood calm, gleaming in the lantern light, his limp now barely visible. At dawn, they loaded Dusty into the trailer. Elijah's hands shook as he latched the gate, not from age, but from nerves he hadn't felt in decades. Luke noticed, but said nothing. Sometimes silence carried more comfort than words. The fairgrounds buzzed with energy when they arrived. Trucks lined the dirt lot. Riders in pressed shirts and polished boots walked tall. Horses gleamed with meticulous care. Elijah felt out of place instantly, his coat frayed, his hat faded, his boots worn. But when Dusty stepped off the trailer, head high, stride steady, the murmurs began. People turned to watch. No longer the broken creature mocked at auction. Dusty now looked every inch a competitor. Luke guided him into the warm-up ring. Horse and rider moved with quiet confidence, each step smooth, each command answered. Elijah leaned on the fence rail, gripping the wood so tightly his knuckles whitened. He wasn't watching a show, he was watching a reckoning. The event was a trail course, designed to test trust and control rather than speed. The judge nodded, and Luke urged Dusty forward. The first gate swung open with ease, the gelding sidestepping patiently as Luke unlatched it. Applause murmured through the crowd. Next came the bridge. Elijah's breath caught. Dusty hesitated, ears flicking, nostrils flaring. Luke whispered low, loosened the reins, and waited. One step, then another. The wood groaned beneath his hooves, but Dusty crossed, steady and unhurried. The crowd broke into applause, louder this time. Obstacle by obstacle, they moved with precision. By the end, Dusty stood tall, ears pricked, his coat shimmering with effort. The scores placed them second overall, behind a polished young rider with a perfect quarter horse. But Elijah hardly noticed. In his eyes, they had already won. As Luke led Dusty back toward the trailer, Elijah stepped forward, hand resting on the horse's neck. His voice was rough, but steady. "You made him whole." Luke shook his head. "No, Dad. He made us whole." The truth of it struck Elijah like a bell. And for the first time in years, he allowed himself the rarest of feelings, hope. The show was over, yet its echo lingered. Dusty stood tied to the trailer, ears flicking at every sound, his body calm but alert, his coat glowing bronze under the afternoon sun. Luke stroked the gelding's neck, his movements gentle, practiced, respectful. Elijah lingered nearby, not speaking, simply watching. For the first time in many years, he felt that strange ache of pride that comes when silence says more than words ever could. The drive home was quiet. Dusty shifted occasionally in the trailer, the sound of hooves against metal a steady rhythm. Luke sat with one arm resting against the open window, eyes fixed on the horizon as the fields rolled past. Elijah gripped the wheel, his jaw set, his mind sifting through the weight of everything left unspoken between them. When they returned to the ranch, evening shadows stretched long across the ground. Elijah backed the trailer to the stable, lowered the ramp, and stepped aside as Luke led Dusty out. The gelding moved with ease, only a faint trace of his old limp remaining. He looked nothing like the horse purchased for $1. He looked like a creature reborn. For several days after the show, the rhythm of life settled into something almost peaceful. Luke repaired more of the old fences. Elijah worked alongside him, their conversation short but steady, like two men finding their way back to language after too long in silence. Dusty remained at the center of it all, the unspoken bond that gave their fractured relationship a thread of continuity. Yet beneath the calm, Elijah sensed the stirrings of something else. Luke had the look of a man restless, carrying a map in his chest that pointed always to the next place. His hands were capable, his eyes sharp, but his shoulders carried the tension of one who had not yet chosen to stay. Elijah feared it, but said nothing, unwilling to fracture what little they had rebuilt. One morning, Elijah found Luke leaning on the fence, staring out toward the open pasture. Dusty grazed nearby, tail flicking lazily. The air was cool, the sky pale with early light. Elijah joined his son without a word, boots crunching softly in the grass. After a long pause, Luke spoke. "I've been thinking," he said, his tone careful. "A friend of mine is driving cattle up in Montana. They're short on hands. He asked if I'd come." Elijah's heart sank, though he kept his voice steady. "You leaving then?" Luke rubbed the back of his neck, gaze never leaving the horizon. Just for a while. A few weeks. Maybe longer. Depends. Dusty lifted his head, ears twitching as though he understood. Elijah studied the horse for a long moment, then turned to his son. You planning to take him? If he's willing, Luke answered quietly. His hand tightened around the fence rail. He'd do well on the drive. Better than most. He's got more heart than half the mounts I've seen. The thought of Dusty leaving twisted Elijah's chest, but he saw the truth in Luke's words. The horse was not broken anymore. He had become strong, steady, whole. And perhaps Elijah thought, so had his son. He stepped closer, shoulders heavy but voice gentle. I spent years trying to make this place what your mama wanted. In doing that, I forgot to be what you needed. Maybe if I'd listened more, you wouldn't have walked away. Luke finally turned, his expression taut. I wasn't ready to stay, Dad. Even if you had asked, I'd have gone. But maybe I should have come back sooner. The honesty hung between them, fragile but real. Dusty snorted softly, breaking the silence like punctuation. Elijah sighed, leaning against the fence. I'm not asking you to stay. But the south pasture still needs work. The fence line's weak. If you decide you want a place, there'll be one here. Luke's lips pressed into a faint, almost reluctant smile. I'll think about it. That evening, Luke began packing. A saddle, a coil of rope, a few tools worn from years of use. Dusty stepped into the trailer with calm acceptance, as though he knew this was not an ending, but another beginning. Elijah stood by, holding something small wrapped in a faded kerchief. When Luke latched the last strap, Elijah held it out. Inside lay a single brass spur, aged but polished from years of care. It was your granddad's, Elijah said. He always said it reminded him that pressure only works if you give the release, too. Luke swallowed hard, nodding once. Thank you. They shook hands then, not as strangers, not even solely as father and son, but as men who had walked through fire and returned changed. The truck rumbled to life, pulling the trailer down the dirt road until it disappeared in a haze of red dusk. Elijah stood at the gate long after, the wind stirring the grass around him, the silence pressing once more. But this silence was different. It no longer carried only loss. It carried promise. A week later, a letter arrived. The handwriting was Luke's, quick and slanted, a style Elijah recognized instantly. He unfolded it with careful fingers and read. Dusty crossed the river like he owned it. First day out, he outworked every other mount. You were right. He wasn't broken, just waiting for the right hand. Maybe I was too. Tell the fence I'll mend it when I get back. Elijah read it 3 times before setting it on the table beside his coffee. A smile, small but genuine, tugged at his lips. He looked out the window toward the empty corral and, for the first time in years, felt peace. The ranch moved with its old rhythm in the days that followed. Elijah repaired what he could, tended what remained, and let the quiet of the land settle around him. But there was no longer the sharp edge of loneliness in the air. The memory of hoofbeats lingered, and with it the certainty that both his son and the horse would return. Far away under Montana skies, Luke sat by a campfire, Dusty tethered nearby, his coat catching the glow of the flames. Other cowboys swapped stories, laughter echoing into the night. But Luke remained quiet, pen scratching across the pages of an old journal. The brass spur lay beside him in the dirt, gleaming faintly in the firelight. He paused, glanced at Dusty, and smiled. For the first time in many years, he felt anchored, not to a place, but to the knowledge that he belonged somewhere, that he could always return. Dusty lowered his head, chewing calmly, and Luke leaned back, content. On the ranch, Elijah sat on the porch, sipping coffee as the stars blinked overhead. He closed his eyes, listening to the night's sounds, the creak of the windmill, the whisper of dry grass. In the silence, he almost heard the steady beat of hooves carried on the wind, as though the land itself was reminding him that hope was not gone. The future stretched uncertain, as it always had, but for the first time, Elijah did not fear it. He had a horse who proved that even the broken could heal. He had a son who had walked away and found the strength to come back. And he had a choice, to believe, to wait, to trust. Sometimes redemption does not arrive with fanfare or triumph. Sometimes it comes quietly, in the steady work of mending fences, in the soft weight of a letter in hand, in the presence of a horse who refused to give up. Elijah understood that now. And as dawn broke over the valley the next morning, casting gold across the hills, he stepped into the day with something he had nearly forgotten how to carry: hope.